evening. If anybody cannot hear me at any stage, will they please call out and say so, rather than coming up to me afterwards and saying, Mr. Hitchens, what you said that I could hear was extremely interesting, but I couldn't hear most of it, which is actually very irritating. So call out if I start mumbling. It's important. I won't know necessarily, especially if I get carried away, which I might do. Now, all of you will know of the sort of foolish things that people say about other people's languages. George W. Bush, for instance, is alleged to have said on one stage that the French have no word for entrepreneur. So it's wise when discussing other people's language. Actually, that turns out, I checked it out, that turns out to be a story made up by Shirley Williams about it. It isn't true, but it could be. It's wise when talking about other people's languages to check out what you're saying. And I have checked this out with Russian friends. The Russian word for safety is bezopasnost. Bezopasnost is an interesting word. It forms part of the name of that famous organization, the KGB, Komitet Государственной безопасности, which means the Committee for State Security. And what bezopasnost is a very strange word. It's a negative word. Bez in Russian means without. Bezopasnost means without danger. The word for safety in Russian is a negative word. It is an absence. And this should tell you something very important about the nature of Russia. There are other important things. When I lived in Moscow, in Soviet Moscow, generally a very ugly, dirty, noisy, and often rather repellent city, I would sometimes, for sheer solace, go and visit a beautiful street in the southern part of the city called Bolshoi Ordinka, which contains, amongst other things, the Church of the Consolation of All Sorrows. And the reason for the name of this street, which means the Street of the Great Horde, is that it is where the Golden Horde used to turn up every 5 years to collect their tribute. People say that Asia begins at the Ural Mountains. Well, technically it does, but really it begins at Moscow. It is a frontier city. This is a country which has been invaded by Tatars, by Mongols, by Poles, by Swedes, by Poles again, by the Germans, by the Germans, by the Germans, by us, by the French, repeatedly, over and over again. It has no natural defences. It has no real, the Ural Mountains are about as significant as the Chiltern Hills. They're not particularly impressive. There is no real barrier. They live in constant, realistic fear of invasion. Their second city, now St. Petersburg, was within living memory besieged by an invading army to such an extent that a large number of its population died of starvation. And you can go there and visit the enormous graves. And these are the people who are the grandfathers and great-uncles and great-aunts and grandmothers of people now living. Understand this and you begin to understand, perhaps, why Russians have a rather different attitude towards the world than we do, being surrounded conveniently by large stretches of deep salt water, or than the Americans do, who have the Pacific on one side, and the Atlantic on the other, and Mexico at the bottom, and Canada at the top. How nice, in comparison to having China on one side and Germany on the other, and the Middle East at the bottom, which is what the Russians have to put up with. So please bear this in mind when discussing attitudes towards Russia. Then I like, none of you, I think, are old enough to remember the wonderful Peter Simple's satirical column in the Daily Telegraph, when the Daily Telegraph was a newspaper worth reading. But one of his jokes, and one of his best jokes, was that he invented all kinds of fantastic things, was a war between Sweden and what was then Yugoslavia, the Swedo-Yugoslav War, he called it, which could never get going because the two countries could never fight each other. Now, we are in very much the same position. This country has no borders with Russia. We barely trade with them. We have no actual interests which clash with theirs. They don't pay us much attention. We have no particular reason to be at war with them, and yet here we are at the moment in a country where the government and its military leaders and its Secretary of State for Defense and many of its journalists constantly, to my mind, almost obsessively go on and on and on about the Russian danger. I'm going to ask a question now. How many times have Russian aeroplanes flown into British airspace in the past 5 years? Anybody know?
None.
Exactly. How many times have Russian warships entered British territorial waters in the past 5 years?
3.
None. None. It never happens. It's complete fantasy. There is none of these things happen. If you read various reports and listen to the radio and watch the television without care, you might get the impression these things have happened, but they have not. And we're always being told that British aeroplanes are being scrambled to escort Russian planes. What happens is our airplanes take off. They fly out and they fly alongside Russian planes, many of which are extremely slow and very old, in international airspace. This is not a dramatic event. No one has been scrambled. No one has escorted anybody. But the writing of it constantly raises this endless suggestion that the Russians are being wicked. Now, here's another thing which you might be interested in. Since the collapse of the Soviet regime, which I witnessed, the Moscow government, under whatever name you care to give it, has relinquished control, without any significant bloodshed, of 800,000 square miles of territory, 700,000 square miles of territory in Europe, and another who knows how many in Central Asia. And it has lost control of something like 180 million people in the same period. During the years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the European Union and its military wing, NATO, has gained control over 400,000 square miles and over 120 million people. How is it under those circumstances that Russia can conceivably be classified as an aggressive power? Which one is the expanding power? Which one is the diminishing one? The forces of NATO are 10 times in military strength the size of those of Russia. Russia's gross domestic product is approximately the size of that of Italy. It is not a major country. When we saw another of these episodes a few months ago, what was left of the Russian Navy processing through the Channel, which is, I should point out here, an international waterway, it looked to me as if the only aircraft carrier in possession of the Russian Navy, the Admiral Kuznetsov, was actually fueled by a wood-burning stove. These are not advanced weapons. This is not a country which can afford to spend money on huge aggressive episodes. The countries of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, which are familiar to me because I visited them when they were under Soviet control and fighting to get out of it, were for many years after the collapse of the Soviet Union entirely independent and unmolested, long before they joined NATO or the European Union. They didn't need this protection to remain unmolested. Not perhaps because there mightn't be some people in Moscow who would like to take them over, but because Moscow recognizes it's simply not possible to do so. It's not strong enough to do so. These alleged aggressions are confected. And then I must deal with the question of Ukraine, which is the most fascinating thing of all. Since the end of the Second World War and the establishment of international law in its current form, aggressive war is outlawed in international law, unless you're the United States, in which case you're allowed to do it. But otherwise, you cannot conduct aggressive war. It's illegal. And so what has happened instead is that rather than send armies over people's frontiers, what people do is they bring down governments of countries they wish to disrupt or they wish to take over. We and the Americans did this very notably in Iran in 1953 in the organized overthrow of Mohammed Mossadegh by MI6 and the CIA. Monty Woodhouse, my MP in Oxford, took part in that along with his friend Kermit Roosevelt, and it's all documented what we did, the mobs we bought, the newspapers we paid for, the generals we bribed, we overthrew a more or less legitimate government. And this procedure also was used very much in the Philippines, in the overthrow of Marcos, and in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and most of the colour revolutions in Eastern Europe. I think one can confidently say that some outside interference was involved. It takes, I'm a former Trotskyist activist, it takes a lot of effort, ladies and gentlemen, to organise a spontaneous demonstration. And there we have in Ukraine the most extraordinary episode in which the leading figures of Western politics, Senator John McCain, Catherine Ashton, the High Representative for Foreign Policy of the European Union, Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State in the Washington State Department, Guido Westerwelle, the former Foreign Minister of the Federal Republic of Germany, all turn up in the streets of Kiev, urging on an anti-government mob. Just imagine, I mean, it was a vague comparison, if during the referendum on Scottish independence, a whole load of Russian politicians had turned up in Glasgow, urging people to vote to leave the United Kingdom, and how you would have felt about it. This is what we actively did. There are all kinds of other things that are more questionable. It is actually the case that John Brennan, the head of the CIA, turned up in Kiev a little while after the mob had overthrown the legitimate government here. Whether he was connected with that event, I don't know. He was quite possibly there, as many people are in Kiev on a gastronomic tour. But on the other hand, it's possible he may have been doing something else as well in his spare time. Even so, if you look at the records of the events, what you will find is that the legitimate government of that country was overthrown by a violent demonstration, which was backed by countries which have constitutions and believe in the rule of law at home, and which continue to back it. And you will then find that in what appears to me to be a retaliation for this, the Russians retook Crimea, which they regard, and with some justification, I can discuss this at length with you later if you want, because it's very complicated, they regard very much as we regarded the Falkland Islands when we retook them from the Argentines in 1982. And all this is constantly portrayed as Russian aggression. It isn't. It's Russian response to our aggression. In the 1990s, in the Clinton era, that's fascinating. I'll give you books which you can order from this bookshop which will tell you all of this in detail. In the 1990s, the two fascinating things happened, which in the United States, one of them was the New York Times, in those days a much more respectable newspaper than it is now, set out to discover exactly why it was the United States Senate had voted for NATO expansion into countries which had formerly been in the Warsaw Pact, which was a contentious matter at the time, and many people thought unwise and countered that. And what their investigations uncovered was a story of immense crudity, almost like an Eric Ambler popular front thriller of the 1930s. What was happening was that huge sums of money were being deployed by the manufacturers of rockets, tanks, helicopters, and military aircraft to effectively buy the support of the United States senators for NATO expansion. It was as crude as that. The arms industry, worried about its future after the Cold War, ended trying to buy itself a new conflict. At the same time, George Kennan, who those of you here who are historians will know practically invented the Cold War, was the American diplomat who wrote the long telegram urging a policy of containment of the Soviet Union in the 1940s, came out of retirement at the age of 94, totally lucid and utterly in possession of his faculties, solely to say, this is the most immense folly. That by expanding NATO at this time, what we will be doing is creating in the future a new Cold War. It's the first time, I believe, the phrase was ever used. And he warned, and he said that not merely is this an act of diplomatic folly, not merely will it create tension where none needs to exist, it is a betrayal of those people in Russia who have overthrown a horrible tyranny and now seek to build up a free country, to treat them like this, and it has been disastrous. The aggressors in this matter have not been the Russians. The aggressors have been the Western alliance, in which Britain has played a very noisy part. Very noisy, especially given that most of our navy can't move because it doesn't work in warm water. Our army has been reduced to ribbons, and our air force is rapidly degrading as well. A lot of noise as comes out of empty vessels, and we are very much engaged, it seems to me, in an aggressive megaphone diplomacy against a country which offers no threat to us. The subject of the Skripals of Litvinenko will come up, and I will say only this, that the Russian state is not a simple matter, but I would say it seems to me to be extremely unlikely from what I know of it, that direct instructions have come from the Kremlin or from Vladimir Putin, a man who I believe to be a sinister tyrant and do not defend his internal affairs at all. I do not believe direct instructions ever came from there for the killing of Litvinenko or the attempted killing of the Skripals. And to suggest that life is that simple seems to me to be an act of considerable folly. So be careful with that, and also remember that in our own dealings as a country, I mentioned what we did in Tehran. I might also mention what the French did in New Zealand with the Rainbow Warrior, where their secret service blew it up. People are not all saints in foreign policy, and it's sometimes very important to remember, first of all, that there are other countries in the world which are wicked as well as Russia, and with whom we are on very good terms. And I will, at this point, mention one of those countries because it is so important. The country which is really a menace to its neighbours, probably to the peace of the world, probably to the freedom of the world, is the one we never say anything about, and whose leaders we invite to dinner at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. This is the country which, when it had the opportunity to do what Russia has done, and to end a communist dictatorship, instead massacred its own people in huge numbers in Tiananmen Square, the People's Republic of China. It seems to me that a lot of our shouting and banging tables about Russia is displacement activity born of shame out of our inability to challenge a real menace to us in China. And I think we should grow up out of it and begin to be more realistic. Thank you very much.